So I'm a assistant professor at Oregon Institute of Technology, or just Oregon Tech, and I started there last year. Been there a year and a half. Prior to that, I was a postdoc at University of Washington for 5 years, a postdoctoral researcher there. So I worked with researchers like Greg Wilson Mantilla, that I'll highlight some of his work today, and then a bat researcher, Charlene Santana, there. So I had a couple different positions there. Before that, got my PhD at University of Chicago, master's at Indiana University, and before that, I taught high school biology for 4 years. So have kind of bounced around a bit, but happy to be in Oregon and Oregon Tech, smaller school down in Southern Oregon, but a fun place to live and a nice community there. We got a really good anatomy and physiology program, pre-nursing program. So I teach mostly anatomy and physiology there and really enjoy it. And today I chose to talk on something kind of broad. It's kind of a more general audience talk, and just ask the question, what is a mammal? And try to highlight some recent fossil discoveries and really kind of get into Mesozoic mammals, especially early mammals. And I thought, what is a mammal, was a kind of maybe a good catchy question to ask to attract people to this talk. But a more maybe a better question or title for this talk is, what traits did the earliest mammals possess? So I'm going to kind of focus a bit on some traits, and I'll get sidetracked on a little bit of fieldwork story here, but that's kind of my goal today. Oops. All right, so I was preparing a talk like this years ago, and I did a search for like origin of mammals, like a Google search or earliest mammals or something. And I came across this slide and I saved it. And I've kind of used it in presentations before as just kind of like, what's the stereotype, or what's the textbook definition of or story, I guess, for the origin of mammals. And this is from I think an AP, so advanced placement high school biology teacher's presentation. And this is probably in a more advanced high school, college, or college textbook on just over biology. That just kind of some basic points about what early mammals were like. So I'm going to read these off, but we're going to come back to these in the end and see how well these traits all hold up. So again, I didn't make this; somebody else made this from a textbook. Uh, Origin of mammals. Oldest fossils of mammals date back about 200 million years. Fossil evidence indicates mammals evolved from reptiles called therapsids. Early mammals coexisted with dinosaurs but were mouse-sized and ate insects. These early mammals were nocturnal and endothermic, or warm-blooded. Mammals took over all habitats and diversified once the dinosaurs went extinct, or at least the non-avian dinosaurs. Mammals, or definition of mammals here at the end, is that they are endothermic vertebrates that possess mammary glands and hair. So we'll come back to this at the end and see how well that high school teacher did. Not picking on the high school teacher, but see just how more on the textbook, I guess, that information came from. All right, so there's a Ray Troll image you've probably seen before. I love this image. I put this in a lot of talks as a way to kind of introduce the time period that I might be interested in. And I'm most interested in the Mesozoic and the early mammals from the Mesozoic. And also into the early Cenozoic, so really capturing the early mammals and their diversifications after that extinction event about 66 million years ago. Earth during that time, during that span from about 200 million years ago, when mammals, or roughly when mammals evolved, to about 66 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct. You see a lot of separation of those continents. We went from Pangea shortly before this to breaking up into kind of a northern Laurasia theria and Gondwana in the southern, and then those breaking up. And in 66 million years ago, you can make out most of our modern continents. You got India still kind of floating towards Asia there. So it was a very different world during this time. There's a lot of environmental things going on. that probably had an influence on our mammals and our dinosaurs at that time. And then at 66 million, oops, sorry, got ahead of myself. Mammals originate again around 200 million years ago, but we'll get back to that a little bit later. And dinosaurs originated shortly before that. So most of mammalian history overlaps with dinosaur history. Dinosaurs maybe going back 220, 230 million years ago, but they're not all that far off. We think of it as being kind of Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs, dominated by dinosaurs, and then the Cenozoic being the age of mammals, and mammals really diversifying there. So we tend to talk about dinosaurs in the Mesozoic. We tend to talk about mammals in the Cenozoic, but really there's considerable overlap. 2/3 of mammalian history is actually overlapping with dinosaurs. And then again, non-avian dinosaurs at about 66 million years ago. That's when our meteorite hits, explosion occurs, our dinosaurs go flying and crash back down. And so I love this image, but one issue with that image is that it's not to scale, or not even close to scale. You got 10,000 years of the Holocene. That's about as thick as their Cretaceous, which is 80 million years. So to put that into a more accurate scale here, this is what it would actually look like. And again, the stereotype for these early mammals, they're small little insectivores. They're nocturnal. They're just coming out at night and they're endothermic, so they're warm-blooded, so they can kind of survive in the cold at night. They might have better vision than the dinosaurs, and whereas the dinosaurs, reptiles are active more during the day. They're exothermic, so they're soaking in sunlight, things like that. And there's plenty of debate on that from both the dinosaur side of that story and the mammal side of that story. But this is kind of, again, that textbook kind of stereotype. And then about 66 million years ago, when that meteorite strikes, and possibly other causes that trigger mass extinction event, knocks out those non-avian dinosaurs, it opens up these ecological niches for all kinds of aquatic mammals, massive mammals, marsupials with pouches, flying mammals, all kinds of things evolved shortly after that event. So again, this is the stereotypical story. I think there's probably more to that story, and hopefully I'll convince you that there's a little bit more to that story. But to investigate that story, field work is critical. So I try to make it out to the field as much as I can. I've made it out to New Mexico and the earliest Paleocene and Nacimiento Formation, made it to Utah, Morrison Formation. I've also worked in a couple other formations in Utah. And I'm mostly looking for mammals, things like this. So this is most of the molars are broken here, but or most of the teeth are broken, but this is a big carnassial molar. If you ever look in a dog's tooth, look at the teeth of a dog, they have one really prominent molar with a big shear crest. They call that the carnassial molar. And this thing is like 65.5 million years old. This is shortly after the mass extinction event, showing that these very kind of derived features of these big shearing teeth appeared not all that long after the mass extinction event, 66 million years ago. So something I've found there, and I'm always interested in trying to help crews find more. However, sometimes those pesky dinosaurs show up, and while we're in the Mesozoic, we run into dinosaurs. So I'm going to get a little sidetracked here talking about a dinosaur that we found. Some of you have probably heard about this one, but this is in Montana, Hell Creek Formation, the latest Cretaceous Hell Creek Formation, about 68 to 66 million years ago. I saw Greg Wilson, Gregg, with an extra G in the name, in the Zoom crowd. He's been out there with me working on plant fossils. I go out there about every summer and try to work on finding mammals, but again, we occasionally find these pesky dinosaurs. This is in work with the other Greg Wilson, with only 2 G's in his name, and now goes by Greg Wilson Mantilla. And then his lab, his grad students, and his postdocs and lab managers. He's got a huge crew that goes out to Montana every year. And I work with him. That's through the Burke Museum and University of Washington. So even though I'm now at Oregon Tech, I still joined their crew for a week or two last summer. All right, so this picture is an exciting picture. This is the beginning of, you can kind of, it's kind of in the shade. It's not a great photo, but you can see some sort of bone underneath that red arrow there. And I crop this because on the other side of this is Jack Horner, the advisor on the Jurassic Park movies, famous dinosaur paleontologist. And you might wonder, well, why did he come out here? Well, he came out because he got word that we had found a T-Rex skull, and that's what we kind of thought this might be. And he wanted to come out and evaluate it. He was working down the road, and he came and stopped by and checked it out. And so all we see is this right here, and we're curious as to what's in that rock, in this kind of wall of rock right here, whether it's a full skull or not. And so, here's our T-Rex skull. We're kind of curious as to what part this is. And to help inform us, we zoomed in on Dave DeMar. He's one of Greg Wilson's field crew members, longtime lab manager and field crew member with Greg. And he has a tattoo, and the tattoo image is actually an image from one of Jack Horner's books. So it was kind of a surreal moment seeing this tattoo being used as he's moving his arm around, trying to figure out what part of the skull of this T-Rex we might be looking at here. Yeah, and he and Jack Horner are looking at his tattoo to help figure it out. But what turned out is this is actually upside down. So what we're looking at here, some squamosal bone back here, and this is probably what we're looking at. You can kind of see the little lens-shaped portion here, like you see in here. And so we had to kind of turn Dave's arm upside down there to figure that out. Now, this is just part of it. We could just have a fragment of a T-Rex skull back there. So at this point, we don't really know what we found, but we search a little bit down here where we expect to find teeth, and we quickly find a really nice tooth there. So we spent a lot of time digging. Here's that original find. We put a plaster jacket on it. We found some other fragments there. Down here underneath the shade tarp, we found some chunks of like some limb bones. That's what was originally found that drew us to check this area out. But we spent a lot of time digging out the quarry basically above this because we unfortunately have about 10 feet of difficult rock above this. Here's another image of this. And one of the things that's exciting about this fossil site is that there's a coal layer up on the hill that we can see. And that coal layer marks it was the depositional environment, so it was a swampy environment when that mass extinction occurred, when that meteorite hit. So we can put this into temporal context, and we can estimate that we were just a couple 100,000 years away from that event based on the rate of deposition of the sediment from our fossil to that event. It's a very rough estimate, but we can at least make estimates. So kind of a very cool spot. Once we dug that out, so here, again, we had this big wall of rock. We dug this out. We eventually got what was most of a skull, what we think is most of a skull in plaster, but we left most of the rock around it to protect it. And the original little bit that we found would be over here. So really mostly just a big chunk of rock that we hope there's a skull under. And then here's the jaw over here. Show you what that looks like as they prepped that out. And then it turned into this beautiful complete T-Rex jaw. And then taking the rest of the skull out took a little bit more work, some help from the locals there, and the ranchers eventually got it back to the Burke Museum. Again, a lot of you may be familiar with this specimen there, but it was on display for a long time as people prepped it and worked on it. You could visit the museum and see that, and again, some beautiful teeth in there, eventually slowly exposing basically a complete T-Rex skull. Turns out to be about 15 years old, estimated to have been 15 to 20 feet tall, wasn't quite adult, probably sub-adult in age, about, I think, like 80% the size of something like Sue the T-Rex at the Field Museum. So going back to his tattoo, and this is what it looks like now on display at the Burke Museum, and just a incredible find. And it was a privilege to get to work on this, and I like to kind of throw that story into my presentations on some of the work that I'm doing. But again, that's all dinosaur stuff. So let's get back to the question that I asked at the beginning. What is a mammal, or what traits did early mammals possess? Might be a better way to phrase that question. And so first, living mammals. So what do we know for certain from living mammals? Well, we got three major groups. We got the monotremes, the egg-laying mammals like the platypus and echidna, basically just those two. There's a few genera of those, but that's about it. There's several species, but yeah, just though they're down in Australia, and that's about it. They're laying eggs, which is probably an ancestral trait. And then the other two major groups are the marsupials, the pouched mammals. Possums in North America would be an example, but most of these are in Australia. Some taxa are still in South America, and I say still in because they used to be much more numerous in South America, but some of them got kind of chased out of there. But still a lot of like possums down there. I think there's something like 500 species of marsupials, or a few hundred species of marsupials around today. And then everything else, like 5,500 species, close to 6,000 maybe species of mammals alive today, are placental mammals like humans. And so we got these three lineages, and we know what the behaviors of these lineages. We got DNA for these lineages. We can see how we can confidently reconstruct how they're related to each other. The different species are related to each other because of that. But there's much more to this story, of course. And if we go back further, mammals and their extinct relatives together, we call this clade synapsids or synapsida. And they split from the lineage, the diapsids that include reptiles and birds, split from them, I think, a little over 300 million years ago. So this is the lineage leading to our mammals. Here's our what we call in phylogenetics, when we look at these family trees, they're phylogenetic trees, or just evolutionary trees, whatever you want to call them. We call these nodes, where we have these splits right here. And this split where we have monotremes coming off, we would call that the mammalian node or mammal node, because these are our living lineages. Everything within that node we would consider a true mammal. Everything outside of that we would sometimes refer to as a stem mammal. They're on the stem of this lineage of this group. So we got synapsids include those stem mammals and those crown mammals. A lot of, I'm summarizing, a couple hundred million years of evolution here, and just a few example images. But Dimetrodon, the sailback, is a good example of an early synapsid, a well-known early synapsid. But you also have some herbivorous taxa like these dicynodonts. You have more carnivorous taxa like Gorgonops. But the general trend, and early synapsid researchers would probably get mad at me for summarizing it this way, but the general trend is that as you kind of march down this phylogeny towards mammals, you become more and more mammal-like. You see the more of the sprawling gait like reptiles here in these earlier lineages versus more upright gait, more activity, more evidence of endothermy, things like that. And you start to see more mammal-like traits. You'll see with the jaws and the ears, things like that. Those traits start to look more and more like our modern mammals as you march along this backbone of this phylogeny. You got about 250 to 300 some million years ago. You got some exciting fossils of those you can find. You can see that the backbone, like if you look at the vertebrae, they look more reptile-like. They don't have as much differentiation between the cervical and thoracic region as you might see in like modern mammals. Still some kind of more sprawling gait. So they're getting some traits there that are more reptilian, but you're getting, as you march down this tree, you're getting more mammal-like. So the question I'm asking, back to my original question, what are the traits that are unique to mammals? What traits appear at this mammalian node? How can we define mammals based on these traits that appear right here? And so I'm gonna kind of go through a handful of traits and evaluate those and see if they really pop up at this node or not. So one would be nocturnal behavior. So we describe these reptiles, and again, some of these early lineages of synapsids are sometimes commonly called reptiles with kind of air quotes around them because they're not true reptiles, but they look more reptile-like. And so those are considered, all these earlier lineages are usually considered more diurnal, coming out during the day because they're more exothermic. They need, this, energy from sunlight, your heat from sunlight. So one of the common thoughts is that these earliest mammals are very small. If they're very small, they might be, again, endothermic. They might be nocturnal, coming out at night, eating insects. And we see some of these earliest fossils are just tiny. This is actually a little bit before mammals evolved, and you can see a finger for scale or a paper clip for scale. Some of these were just really tiny, like little tiny shrews or mice. And it's hard to test for nocturnal behavior in fossils, but one clue that you can use to try to figure out whether something is diurnal, coming out during the day, or nocturnal, coming out at night, is whether they have big orbits of their eyes. Unfortunately, we find mostly teeth and jaws for these early mammals, or if we find a complete skeleton, they're pretty well crushed. It's kind of rare to have something like this, primate here, like that has as big of eyes as this one does. So it's still a little bit messy to try to use that to figure out early mammals and whether they're nocturnal. However, if we go back a ways, our diapsids or reptiles and our early synapsids have these scleral rings. And the size of these scleral rings have been shown to correlate really strongly with whether you're diurnal or nocturnal. So you tend to have these big ones indicating you have a big eye. You're more likely to be nocturnal, versus smaller ones. You might be more likely to be diurnal, come out during the day. So a study done by my PhD co-advisor at the Field Museum, Ken Angelsic, and his collaborator, Lars Schmitz, they actually came to the conclusion that nocturnality in synapsids predates the origin of mammals by over 100 million years. So sure, these things might be, go back here, these things might be nocturnal, or many of these might be nocturnal, but it's not a trait that necessarily evolved at Mammalia, because we have all these other lineages back here. Not all of them, but there was just a mix. They found some of these early lineages were nocturnal, some were diurnal, and if you look at modern day mammals, we actually have more modern day nocturnal mammals than we have diurnal mammals. It's not surprising that throughout our all of synapsid history, you have a mix of both of them. So there's two things that I think is exciting about this. One, that nocturnal behavior must have evolved much earlier than what we had previously thought, but also it raises the question, really, were all these early mammals nocturnal? If we have a diversity back here and we have a diversity in modern mammals, both diurnal and nocturnal, I'm guessing a lot of these early mammals were kind of a mix of those. We had some species that were more diurnal, more nocturnal, but that work is still undergoing, and we need to find more correlates of that type of behavior, like orbit size, to investigate. All right. So another trait that's often associated with mammals is large brains. This species that I showed you before, this tiny little skull, if we actually look at it, and it's a mammaliform. It's a cousin of mammals. It's outside of true mammals on our tree. If you actually look at the brain relative to the skull size, which is used as like an encephalization quotient, like basically a ratio of how big the brain is to the body or to the skull. It's actually pretty good sized brain, not too far off from what we have in modern day mammals. And here's our mammalian node. Here's this lineage right here, this tiny little mammal, but it's still got a relatively big brain. That's much bigger than some of our earlier lineages before that. So large brains probably, our earliest mammals probably did have relatively large brains, but these traits probably evolved a little bit before that. So maybe that's a little nitpicky there in terms of picking out exactly where they evolved, but it was a few lineages probably before we get to the mammalian node where we really started to get like more modern sized brains. All right, endothermic is a big debate in synapsid evolution. There's still debate as to when exactly this warm-bloodedness in mammals evolved, or in our mammalian ancestors. But as I mentioned earlier, some of these lineages, some of these more derived lineages, like Gorgonops here, It's a little bit more upright. It was an active predator. It was likely shifting towards endothermy. And we often just kind of categorize things as exothermic or endothermic, warm blood or cold blood. And, it's been shown that this is more of a spectrum, and things are most likely some of these dinosaurs, some of these synapsids, some of these, maybe even these early mammals were probably falling somewhere along that spectrum. And it's something that probably it might have evolved multiple times. This kind of true warm bloodedness might have evolved multiple times, and it likely evolved well before we get to mammalia. So, yes, modern mammals, endothermic, but it's not a trait that necessarily evolved with mammals. And so, as mentioned, many pre-mammalian lineages show evidence of endothermy, or at least relatively high metabolic rates based on what clues that we have about those mammals. All right, what about hair? That teacher, I showed you that slide at the very beginning of the teacher that was that mentioned in her definition, or his or her definition of mammals, that they were animals with hair. And it's true, modern mammals have hair. We don't see that, or at least don't commonly see that in other types of animals. We see hair in our monotremes, of course, marsupials and placentals. Uh, Here is a fun fossil that was found that's also one of those mammalia forms. It's cousins of mammals. And it's preserved well enough it was a Chinese specimen where you can actually see the carbonized outline of fur. And so we know that going back before that mammalian node, at least a few of those lineages before already had well-developed hair. And that implies to me, if this is already kind of a full coat of fur right there, most likely they kind of went back further. We'll highlight this one later too. Something else exciting about this is the tail and the vertebrae of the tail are flattened like a beaver's, and it implies that it might have had a beaver-like tail and been semi-aquatic. So even outside of mammals, we might have the evolution of a semi-aquatic taxon. All right, so in summary, at this point, a lot of traits that we associate with early mammals, large brains, endothermy, hair, etc., likely predated the evolution of mammals. I mean, we don't know their exact origins. It's still up for debate for a lot of these, especially like things like endothermy, where we can use different clues like the posture or the behavior, and maybe evidence of look at histology of bones and look at growth patterns, like you would look at the tree rings to determine the ages of trees. They can do the same thing with some of the histology of these early synapsids and look at their growth rates and try to figure out things like endothermy and the metabolic rates and lifespans and life history traits. So there's a lot of that going on right now. It's a lot of exciting research. Some of that at University of Washington, people like Chris Sedor, professor there, ask these types of questions, looking at these early synapsids and the traits that they have and when some of these traits really first evolved. But again, I wouldn't say that these traits evolved with mammals. They're really traits that evolved before mammals. And again, maybe that's being a little bit nitpicky. But if we're truly trying to figure out how do we define mammals and what traits do they have, these traits don't work very well for that. All right, a couple others that I haven't gotten to yet, mammary glands. And this one's a tricky one. I kind of skipped this one because we don't have soft, besides we see those outlines of fur. So occasionally we do have a little bit of evidence of soft tissue, but something like mammary glands, monotremes do have mammary glands, but they're basically just modified sweat glands. And that's what placental marsupial mammary glands are as well. Monotremes don't have nipples, and so they don't. It's basically the milk is just produced in the skin, and there's like kind of a little bit of milk secreted onto the surface of the skin that the babies can lap up. So we know that mammary glands are present in all of our modern mammals, but we don't have really any clue when those first evolved. So it's not a very helpful trait if we're thinking about this question from a paleontological perspective. Again, if we're only worried about modern animals and we say, hey, mammals have mammary glands, reptiles don't, yeah, sure, that works as a trait that helps differentiate those. But I think everybody in the audience here, we're interested in paleontology and what fossils tell us and to try to figure out more details about that story. So one of the the traits that got the most traction, at least in the paleontological world, especially in like the 80s and 90s, for defining what is a true mammal was whether the ear bones and the had separated, evolutionarily separated from the jaw. So in reptiles, we have one inner ear bone or middle ear bone. In mammals, we have three. And those other two had basically migrated from jaw bones into our ear. And so if we look at modern mammals, marsupials, monotremes, we see complete separation of those in adults. We see complete separation in this kind of weird angle, that jaw looking down on the monotreme jaws are sometimes real thin and kind of twisted. But we see that the ear, kind of highlighted over here, I highlighted here, is separated from the jaw, at least in adults. During development, they still might be connected for a while, but they're eventually going to separate during embryonic development. But if we go back, this evolutionary story is really well preserved in the fossil record, and we can kind of track this along the backbone of the synapsid history to mammals. And this is kind of the textbook image. It's from Fuzz Crompton from the Harvard, still alive today, still active with research. I think he's well into his 90s. But his papers from the 60s on this topic are still reproduced in textbooks today, like this one here, where it's showing that evolutionary transition in that bone that's labeled Q or blue right there, and the bone that's pink or the angular bone, that becomes angular bone becomes the malleus or hammer in our middle ear, and then the quadrate here, Q, becomes the incus, or anvil is the nickname for it, in our middle ear. And you can kind of watch that progression occur. For some of these lineages, these bones probably had a dual purpose of both helping with hearing and, maybe wrapping around a large kind of eardrum, like you maybe seeing these last couple lineages here, but also helping support the jaw, being the last little remnants of jaw support. And you might wonder, well, why would that evolve? Why would you have this kind of weird jaw that's got these delicate ear bones that attached? One theory that I really like is that a lot of these were burrowing species, and they would or lived on the ground, and they would put their head down on the ground to hear, and the vibrations of noise from distances would help kind of vibrate their jaw so that they could hear a little bit better. So having your ear attached to the jaw might have benefited them in that way. And you see that a little bit in modern mammals. You might see moles or something that will put their head down or put their head against the wall so they can kind of hear distances through the ground, under subterranean noises. So that's one possibility there, but that's another topic that's debated. A lot of biomechanical studies looking at these kind of delicate bones and how much stress they could have handled if they're also involved in chewing. Anyway, get a little sidetracked there. So back to our story. Here's this last one, this mammaliform, a famous one, Morgan Eucodon. That would have been one of these mammaliform lineages. And again, my tree is overly simplified here. I got all of 55,000. I'm sorry, 5,500 placental mammals, all summarized as one lineage here. So this is just kind of a conceptual phylogeny here, where major groups are represented by one branch, but there would be many branches here of these mammaliforms, and Morgan Eucodontids, the family that this species comes from, was fairly diverse around the end of the Triassic, early Jurassic, about 200 million years ago. And as you can see, it's still got the ear bones well attached to the jaw. And so this classic story is we go from there. Once we get into the crown mammal fossils, we suddenly see a separation like you see here. So it makes for a really nice story. Say, hey, that's a key trait that defines mammals, is this separation of the ear from the jaw. And then about 20 years ago, looking at some of these early lineages, researchers discovered something interesting. And it was kind of a controversial at first. But this, I think, goes back to about 2002 or so, when one of these was first found. It's fossils that still had a little bit. They're crown mammals, so they're within mammals. They're extinct relatives of like placentals and marsupials. I don't think any of these that have this or relatives of monotremes. So these are true mammals, but they're extinct from extinct lineages, aren't represented today. And this is a kind of a weird image, but it's underneath, it's looking at the underside of the jaw. And if you look at the underside of the jaw, you see this little rod coming off of it towards the medial side, so towards the middle, towards the tongue. And presumably what attached to that, this is a last remnant of a ossified ear bone that would have been attached to the middle ear. There's a little gap there, would have been attached right here. This is looking at the lateral side, so we don't see it. It would have been on the other side of this. And this is one that was also found about the same time. This might have been a little earlier specimen. And here you can see that even better on the medial view and the inside view of that jaw. And we call that the ossified Meckel's cartilage. We don't have that. We have that during in humans and modern mammals. We see that Meckel's cartilage during development, but it kind of fades away, or it becomes a little bit of the tympanic rim around the eardrum. But we don't see this ossified bone. Modern mammals don't have this ossified bone cartilage that's stuck to the jaw, which made us realize that what's happening, most likely happening, is this complete separation of the ear from the jaw is likely evolving convergently. The monotreme lineage probably independently evolved separation, and the marsupial placental lineages also probably independently evolved a separation of this middle ear from the jaw, because these earliest lineages that branch right around the mammalian node still have this little bit of connection to the ear. There isn't this full separation. Something else that's interesting is with marsupials and placentals, you can study the embryos, and you can study embryonic development, and you can kind of step through the processes, and you can see when there is still this kind of Meckel's cartilage attached to the jaw, attaching the ear to the jaw early in embryos, and then the detachment of it. And there's a recent study a few years back that actually said it looked like the mechanism that was causing that separation in marsupials and placentals was actually a little bit different, and which implies that maybe there was actually 3 independent separations of this ear from the jaw, and that all 3 modern mammal groups all independently evolved this trait of separation of the ear, complete separation of the ear from the jaw. All right. So what I've been focusing on now for this talk is the definition of mammal. This is a trait-based definition. And what I mean by that is, as paleontologists, we're looking for what traits that these lineages evolved at that node. And if you look at something like a lot of times we use those traits to name our clades, our groups of organisms. So like tetrapods means 4 legs, and it's animals that evolved on the land that have 4 legs, or vertebrates, things that have a vertebral column, a backbone. And so we name things based off those traits that evolve at those nodes. And again, mammary glands would be an example of why we call the mammals, or those are linked together. So that trait that's associated with these mammals. But in modern day, we try to avoid trait-based definitions, and instead are focused a little bit more on cladistic definitions or phylogenetic definitions, where we basically say, okay, let's make a phylogenetic tree of monotremes, marsupials, placentals, see where that node is, and then anything that falls within that node in our phylogeny, in our phylogenetic tree, we'll call that a mammal, and then everything that falls out. And there's going to be a mix of traits here or there coming there, but let's not worry about individual traits as much as what just that tree looks like. So that's the way the kind of research has gone in the last 20, 30 years. There's been kind of a revolution of like, let's define these groups more by how they're related to each other, and where these nodes are at. So that's all good and well. However, we have to agree on where this node is on this tree, and what these early lineages are. These early lineages within mammals, these early fossils, because we don't have DNA for these early fossils. So we don't know, we can't use those molecular evidence that's usually pretty reliable to figure out what they're related to. So we got to use morphology, and we have to go back to using traits. So we basically circle back around to this trait-based definition, is that we have to look at traits that help us determine how they're related to each other. And I'll highlight this issue with a recent problem. This was about 10 years ago. Lowe here at the Jieshi Lowe was my co-advisor at the University of Chicago when I did my PhD there. And Meng Jin is a curator, very famous, well-known curator at the American Museum of Natural History. And they're both from China originally, and they get access to some amazing specimens coming out of China. So the museums over there basically try to beg them to come over and look at their incredible mammal fossils and write up papers that get into Nature and Science and big journals, and they get all kinds of publicity for this. And about the same time, someone had found a bunch of these, what we call heramiidins, these early mammalia forms, a group very closely related to like Morgan eucodontids, or at least believed to be at the time. Uh, and they each got a hold of basically a full skeleton or multiple skeletons of these heramiids. And they both independently worked on them, and they looked at the traits, they scored them. And so for when we do phylogenetics in paleontology, we look for like absence or presence of certain traits, and we make a big chart of or matrix of full of, sometimes even hundreds of traits, and say yes or no whether they have it. And we run it through a program and a fancy algorithm, and the computer spits out what's the likely relationships of these species. So Lowe independently did this with some specimens. Meng independently did this, and they happened to be working on these heramiidins at the same time, and they both submitted to Nature, major publication, one of the top publications across all science. They submitted their papers about the same time, and Nature decided to publish them at the same time, which would be all well and good, except for they came to very different conclusions on what that phylogeny looks like. So Meng thought that heramiidins had enough traits that should put them in crown mammals, that they should be considered true mammals, that they're within this if you take monotremes, marsupials, placentals, you look at that common ancestor for those three groups right here, heramiidins, and his analyses, basically how he scored traits and how he looked at these fossils and the fossils he worked on, came out within crown mammals. And these are almost 200, some of these heramiidins go back to over 200 million years old. So if you have some of these that go back that far, that means that mammalian node must be older than that. And that would mean it's probably about 220 million years old for that mammalian node. If you look at Lowe's phylogeny, his analyses had heramiidins come out outside of the crown mammal. And because these are much older than our earliest crown mammals, that pushes back. That means that he gets a much earlier date for crown mammals. And so there's a 40 million year difference. And these two studies that came out back to back in the same issue of Nature basically came to completely different conclusions as to where these heramiidins were phylogenetically, and that has huge implications for the age of that mammalian node. So even when we have these full skeletons that we can examine, we can look at traits, we can compare, there's still a subjectivity to it, where one researcher sees it one way, another researcher sees it a different way. These were different fossils, they're different species, but they have enough similar traits. They're almost certainly both heramiidins and closely related to each other. So really fascinating controversy that's still debated today. A couple recent studies have thought that maybe heramiidins should be split into two groups, with some of them within the crown mammals, like Lowe argued, and some of them outside of the crown, like Meng argues. It gives them a little bit of a compromise, but I don't think either Lowe or Meng really like that compromise, so it's still under debate. So our trait-based definition is not satisfactory. Our cladistic definition of mammals is not satisfactory, at least in my mind. And so, we really still are investigating that question of what is a mammal. So my research, and if I'm going late here, feel free to tell me to hurry up, but I want to just quickly touch on another topic here. My research is, even though I'm really interested in phylogenetics and how these are all related to each other, what I focus on more is actually the ecological diversity of the Mesozoic mammals and how much ecological diversity there was through time. And these are usually, again, stereotyped as these Mesozoic mammals as small little insectivores. But as I showed you earlier, there's some cool examples of things that were not small insectivores. So I showed you this jaw before, and this jaw was really cool because it had that ossified Meckel's cartilage showing that there was still part of the ear attached to the jaw. But the other really cool thing about this species is that they found some more specimens of it published in 2005 that where they saw some stomach contents, or what they believe are stomach contents, because they're just basically in the right below the ribs. They zoomed in, and what they realized is there are little fragments of dinosaurs in there, and they believe this was a carnivorous badger-like mammal from, I think, about 125 million years ago, so early Cretaceous, and not one of our modern groups that's alive today. It would have been outside of marsupial and placentals, one of these extinct lineages. And so this thing badger size, which is orders of magnitude larger than mice, and it was carnivorous, so it wasn't just eating insects. Another example I got to work on, I was co-author on this project, working on some amazing specimens from the Jurassic that are mammalliforms related to those hairomyidins that I just showed you. And these are believed to have patagia, or wings like modern day gliders have. And they're not closely related at all to modern day gliders. There's been independent evolution of gliding behavior way back in the Mesozoic, in the middle Jurassic, like 160 million years ago, I think. We did some morphometrics. For the sake of time, I'll kind of skip over that here because I think I'm running a little late here. But I did some morphometric analysis, digging different measurements of the limbs to further test that. And the limb dimensions matched up really well with modern day gliders, which is what we're kind of showing here. Here's the fossils, like limb traits for like the ulna, and how it matches up with modern day gliders. So we found some more quantitative evidence besides just the kind of the soft tissue outlines of what looked like patagia. So we have a wide variety. I showed you that beaver-like specimen earlier. We got some gliders. We got the carnivorous badger-like Repenomamus. We got tree climbers. We got burrowers. We got a variety. We don't have nearly as much variety of diversity as we have today, of course. We don't have any power flyers like bats. We don't have fully aquatic like dolphins, whales, but we do have an amazing amount of ecological diversity already found back in the Mesozoic. One of those groups that was very diverse ecologically, multi-tuberculates. And here we got an example of one that was a tree climber. But if you look at their teeth and you study the teeth, we can correlate the teeth with diet. So the stereotype is all Mesozoic mammals were ground-dwelling insectivores. Well, were they all eating insects, or maybe eating carnivorous like Repenomamus? We look at the teeth. This is a scan of the teeth of multi-tuberculates, or one of them that was more herbivorous, and you can see it looks like a washboard. Like modern day rodents have a lot of kind of washboard or herbivorous taxa that would help grind up plant matter. This was almost certainly herbivorous, not insectivorous. And this one specifically actually lived a little bit after the KPG boundary, but it has relatives that go back before the KPG boundary. So it likely had herbivorous or at least omnivorous relatives. And there's other examples of omnivorous and herbivorous species back here. This led Greg Wilson from University of Washington to argue that multi-tuberculates were already experiencing adaptive radiation before the mass extinction event, and it wasn't really the mass extinction event that triggered their diversification. I came to a similar conclusion looking at teeth of marsupial placental ancestors back here. They already seem to be diversifying well before the mass extinction event, at least 10, 15, 20 million years before that in terms of ecological diversity. A lot of these lineages were already diversifying. So I would even challenge that stereotype that mammals didn't really diversify until the KPG boundary, because I think they were already on the rise, somewhat on the rise before that. Angiosperms, flowering plants, were evolving right about that same time. So both myself and Greg and others have hypothesized that maybe the increase in seeds and leaves and houses, basically houses that they lived in, the trees that they lived in, that might have helped benefit those mammal lineages before the boundary. All right, so the question, were all Mesozoic mammals ground-dwelling insectivores? No, there's much more diversity in that, both from terms of locomotion, tree climbing, burrowing, gliding, all that good stuff, and from a dietary standpoint. We have carnivores, omnivores, herbivores, and of course the stereotypical insectivores. So going back to this high school teacher's presentation, origin of mammals, oldest fossils of mammals date back about 200 million years. That's actually pretty accurate, but we really really don't know. It could be 220, could be 180, depending on which researcher you ask, but 200 is fairly close. Fossil evidence indicates mammals evolved from reptiles called therapsids. That's not accurate. Mammals are synapsids. They're not from the reptilian lineage. Therapsids are one of the groups of synapsids that mammals kind of spurred off of. So that's somewhat accurate, but I wouldn't say we evolved from reptiles. Early mammals coexisted with dinosaurs, true, but were mouse-sized and ate insects. That's a stereotype that's been refuted. There's a lot more diversity in size and diets than that. Although admittedly, many probably were small and ate insects, but we have a lot more diversity than that. These early mammals were nocturnal and endothermic. Maybe, but I would say that those traits evolved well before mammals, so that's not something that we should necessarily classify mammals based off of or define mammals based off of. Mammals took over all habitats and diversified once the dinosaurs went extinct. And this is a little nitpicky, but I would say that mammals were already starting to fill in habitats before dinosaurs went extinct. And our definition of mammals, endothermic vertebrate that possesses mammary glands and hair. That's a good definition, trait-based definition if we're only focused on modern mammals. But if once we get into that paleontology realm and we try to look for those traits, we find that a lot of those traits were probably evolved well before mammals. All right, so what is a mammal? I don't know. That's the conclusion of my talk. I'm reminded of the Dunning-Kruger effect that we're confident early on when we learn about something that we understand it, and as we learn more and more about it, we realize we don't really know what's going on. So, in terms of mammal origins and what is an early mammal, I'm probably somewhere there on that graph or thereabouts. I like that the PhD here is shown us with zero confidence. Going into your PhD defense with your committee grilling you can be nerve-wracking, and yes, you don't really have much confidence at that point. So happy to take questions. Again, sorry for going if I went a little late there, but hopefully that was informative, and yeah, thanks for your attention.
Fantastic. I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of questions, and we're not going to worry about time because this is too interesting, and we can take care of business later. I have a question I'm going to start off with because I just started watching sort of snippets of the new NOVA program on how the birds made it through the extinction event that the rest of the non-avian dinosaurs didn't. And I just jumped through it real quick to try to get to the punchline. And I wasn't thinking about this, but they're proposing that a lot of the birds were burrowers, that they lived underground as well. And and so I thought, oh, I teach this stuff to middle school students sort of roughly, not high school level yet, of course. And so you've added in a whole nother twist to this, because I was under the impression that most of the mammals that survived were probably ground dwellers as well. But we have, as you're proposing, others filling other environments at the time, other habitats. So my first question then would be, of all those habitats that they were filling, were any of them more conducive to survival through the mass extinction than the others? If you're in a tree and the tree's dead, do those survive a different way, or do those mammals go extinct? And was there a certain group that, by where they lived, survived better than the others from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are limited in that we don't have many spots around the world where we can test that pattern, and we can do it in Montana, but Montana is one little area of the world, and it's relatively close to Yucatan Peninsula where that meteorite hit. So we might have got hit harder here. So the studies that have been done by like Greg, where he's looked closely at the species before the boundary and he looked closely at the species after, he estimates, I think that it's like 80 or 90% of species in the area probably went extinct. And I would guess, if anything, that's probably an underestimate. I wouldn't be surprised if it's more than that, partly because we're probably underestimating species diversity because it's really hard to differentiate a lot of these species just based on little fragments of teeth and jaws that we find. So if you think about it, if we lost, let's say 95% of all mammals at that mass extinction event, um, dinosaurs, they had a handful of bird lineages that likely made it across. They might be at like 95 to 98%. Like it's not really all that different in terms of, wasn't that like, hey, mammals made it across great and dinosaurs took the brunt of it. Both clades, both groups got hit really hard by that mass extinction event. Mammals, I think one of the reasons that more lineages of mammals survived, and then again, like you mentioned, the birds survived, is they're some of the smallest species. So of those, it's a lot of kind of small mammals that probably survived. There's kind of a rapid diversification in body sizes of mammals right after the boundary, but that doesn't occur. The species that we find immediately after are still pretty small. So, looking at if you're a big triceratops and you're eating a ton of plants and 90% of plants get wiped out at the boundary, you just can't find enough food to survive. But if you're eating a little bit of nuts and seeds and insects here and there, bark that you can survive for a few generations and make it through, then you're in pretty good shape. So I think the mammals, looking at I cited my study where I argued the mammals are already diversified, or at least one group, the therine mammals, that led to our marsupials and placentals. I argued they already diversified before the boundary. It looks like the groups that really survived the best, from my limited kind of data for that, to answer that question. It looks like there are a lot of them were kind of omnivorous slash insectivorous, and would make sense that you'd be more of a kind of a generalist that could kind of eat a little bit of everything. Because if you're a specialist and you eat one plant or you eat one type of insect, then if that insect or that plant gets wiped out at the boundary, you're screwed. But if you're more of a generalist that can eat a little bit of everything, when it calls for it, you're more likely to survive. So that's what I can kind of comment on from my research, that I've seen a little bit of evidence that there was a kind of a little bit more omnivorous generalist diet, and small species that survive kind of maybe like a mouse or rat like in a way, but a little bit more insectivorous than them. And then I've seen the evidence for the birds being burrowers, but it's really limited evidence because we don't have that many bird fossils. And so it's a really cool hypothesis. I know that some of the researchers who have promoted that hypothesis, I really respect their work. But I think it comes with a big asterisk that we just don't have enough fossils to know really what the locomotion was, what their habitat was, because you basically need the limb data. So not only, I mean, with mammals, we find a lot of teeth and jaws, but we don't find many limbs around the KPG boundary. So the examples of all those fun examples I showed you there, most of those are like early Cretaceous and Jurassic from China, these Lagerstätten amazing preserved specimens. We rarely find, more than maybe one or two little limb bones to go with 1,000 teeth that we find. For every 1,000 teeth that we find in Hell Creek Formation in Montana, we might find one limb bone. So we really don't have much evidence for what type of, were the mammals burrowers, were they tree climbers? And what little evidence that we have is that there was probably a little bit of a mix. But there have been people promoted that have promoted the idea mammals were more burrowing, more ground dwelling at that time, but I think it's really limited evidence. So not a very satisfactory answer, but that's my thoughts on it.
Thank you.
I just got a procedure question. Can I put your email in the minutes
Sure.
so people can contact you?
Yeah, and I can go back to my slide in case anybody wants to see that highlighted here.
Other questions here before I get to people online? Okay, hold on. I'm bringing you to another.
Hi, that was a fantastic talk. You mentioned accidentally coming across dinosaurs. In your field work, have you come across archaic primates in North America? like Purgatorius, those sort of?
I might have found one or two. I mean, when I go out there, I'm kind of helping. I help with some outreach projects. We take K through 12 teachers out. Maybe some of you have heard about the Dig Field School run by the Burke Museum. I help with that. So I'm not out there as much as some of the other field crew, like Dave DeMar, who has the tattoo I showed. He's sometimes out there for 2 or 3 months over the summer. And those who are out there for longer look at a lot more fossil localities. They find a lot more mammals, and we have found some of those, those archaic primates or plesiodaphiforms, we call them. They're like stem primates. They do find them in that area. But most of the time I'm usually, when I get out there, helping a little bit more in the Hell Creek Formation, which is pre-KPG, the Cretaceous, and I don't think we have found any from that time period. So if I have found one or two teeth of those, or I might have found one or two teeth of those earlier, but anyway, the group that goes out there definitely finds them, and especially from the younger ages rock, the higher up on the hill. If we go higher up in the hill in certain areas out there where we get more into like that 65.5 million years, where you're kind of 500,000 years into the Cenozoic, then we definitely find those teeth.
Thank you. Other questions here? Okay, how about online?
I have a question, or maybe just an observation. So your general hypothesis is compelling. That we have these traits that are evolving independently, but the definition of a mammal is that they bring them all together. They're a constellation at one point. And you didn't really get to that. I mean, at what point are we bringing all of these disparate lines of evolution together and we say, aha, that indeed is a full-scale mammal?
That's a good point, but a lot of those, like endothermy I mentioned, is still debated where on that stem, where on the mammalian stem, that trait evolved. And hair, we know evolved before mammals, but we don't really know much before that. We don't have the preservation of the soft tissue to see if some of those earlier lineages, like that, Gorgonopsian that I showed, like maybe it had a little bit of hair by then already. So we don't really know if that those traits that we commonly use to define, we really have no clue on mammary glands, like I mentioned. So we don't really know, I focused on one trait at a time, but even if you kind of merge all those traits, we still don't really know when they all appear. So I think it's still a question there. I think it's more, I brought that cladistic definition at the end where we kind of use our phylogeny and we use our last common ancestor and that node to kind of define things. I think that's really where we're going, is trying to pinpoint, do more robust phylogenetic analyses to try to figure out where that node is on our tree, where that branch, the original branching mammals were. But that still may never be satisfactory, because there'll always be debates, because that's not represented by a single fossil that we can look at, and we can look at the traits. It's a hypothetical ancestor that we kind of reconstruct. So I don't think we'll ever be fully satisfied by what traits those early mammals had.
One other quick question. I remember a study that appeared, well, it was on television. They part of a Nova series. But the point was that the first million years after the Big Impact, that the rate of evolution accelerated tremendously. And so I would presume that we have these independent lines of evolution, and then we get to 66, and all of a sudden, all of these ecological niches are opened in ways that had not been as accessible previously. And so we get very, very rapid evolution at that point. It becomes much easier to tackle the question.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm sure there was some filling of ecological niches. One of the things that we first really start to see a few million years after the extinction is large herbivorous mammals. So the mammals I mentioned, like multituberculates that were herbivorous, they're still like rodent, like rat type, size. But we don't really get the large, like, cow size herbivores until a few million years later. And those things like that really start to fill in and grow. So I think if there's one area of kind of ecological space that the dinosaurs really vacated that we started to do a good job of filling in, it'd be that large herbivore kind of ecological space, like things like triceratops and hadrosaurs going extinct, that mammals kind of took over that. So I'm sure there was kind of rapid evolution into that. But I think in terms of a lot of other ecological, like there's weasel-like, carnivores before the boundary. There were in the insectivores. There was all the locomotor modes I showed, like the gliding and the burrowing and all this. I think we were already kind of filling, some ecological niches before. And so that there wasn't maybe as rapid of ecological diversification after that boundary as we originally thought, because we were actually doing better before than we realized. One thing to keep in mind too is some of the studies that have argued that there was this rapid diversification. One of the studies came out in 2013, and it said, we think placental mammals specifically, listen, they didn't worry about marsupials as much, but the placental mammals just burst at the KPG boundary and diversified really fast, filling in those ecological niches. Another study looked at their data, including their molecular data and their DNA data, and they did an analysis on that data and said, for that rapid of evolution to have occurred within the first few 100,000 years, you would have had to have major groups of mammals like primates and carnivorans and insectivores and all these different groups for them to evolve so rapid, all these major groups of mammals to evolve so rapidly and have such major differences in DNA within a few 100,000 years, that the mutation rates would be at the rate of virus mutation rates. They would just be astronomical mutation rates. And so from a DNA evidence, this rebuttal came out and said, no, it couldn't, all placental mammal groups couldn't have diversified that rapidly at the KPG boundary. Some of them must have came from before, or you would just have, absurdly high mutation rates that you never see in animals. So I think there's at least some, at least some lineages that cross that boundary that were already a little bit more, leaning towards that modern carnivorans, or leaning towards modern day bats or different things like this, the stem groups for a lot of the stem primates, like we mentioned before. I'm sure some of those lineages predate that KPG boundary, and then they kind of individually, those different groups diversified afterwards.
That's a great question, and that leads me to a middle school question that I got that I wasn't sure I had a good guess to. And it's kind of related to that, in that, do you have a guess, and I haven't asked this of an expert yet, how big of a radius do you think the blast zone was that wiped out 100% of everything that was there? And the reason I'm asking that is, my students have speculated that if you're on the other side of the planet, then you're not experiencing the immediate effects of this meteor impact, but the aftermath of it weeks later, and then for months or whatever years. How far did the blast go that wiped everything out, and did that take out species, or was it for the mammals that the 95% you were talking about, if that's the number, how long did it take for those to die out? It's kind of a double question there.
Yeah, and I don't have a good answer to that, to be honest. That's outside of my area of expertise. I think that some of the geologists that study that question would give you a better answer, because they've looked at blast radius, and they looked at the amount of basically crap that got put into the atmosphere. I think certainly animals globally would have been affected, because it sounds, from what I've read, it seems like you would have had toxic materials and gases and ash and things that were basically covered the sky over the entire globe. But I do think that that high percentage of 90% of mammals that are went extinct on our side in the North America, probably higher than what it was on the other side in Asia, because yeah, you didn't have that immediate fallout. You didn't have the little glass sphericals and things that were basically just raining down on North America and maybe South America as well. So yeah, the other side probably got it a little easier. Some evidence for that, it's kind of negative evidence, I guess, that things did a little better on the other side, is that after when you look at the Cretaceous in Montana, and then you look at the Paleocene in Montana, you suddenly get what are basically interpreted in the Paleocene after that event as invasive species, basically things that have come from nowhere. Like we don't see them anywhere else, and suddenly within 50,000 years of the KPG boundary, within a few inches of the boundary on our rock layers, you have some of these like archaic ungulate type things that are supposed believed to be like relatives of modern day ungulates that were still kind of omnivorous, but at the time, but they probably survived over in Asia or elsewhere, and then migrated into North America once everything got kind of wiped out in North America, or most things got wiped out. So there is that kind of negative evidence where you can kind of say, well, we're guessing these things kind of survived a little bit better elsewhere and then migrated into North America, and we suddenly see them in our fossil record. Unfortunately, we just don't have a good fossil record in Asia, right? Before and after the KPG boundary. We have a little bit in India that people are working on, but it's still pretty limited in what information's coming out of there. So yeah, I don't know if that probably doesn't answer your question very well, but yeah, it's a tricky issue.
No, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Other questions online?
I
I got a
Go ahead.
question
Go ahead,
too, or
Ken.
comment. I was just going to say, as the Earth rotates after the initial blast, it goes out everywhere, and the Earth rotates around. Wouldn't the jet stream like take a lot of that stuff that's in the air and put it closer to the equator on both sides of it, and keep it away from the poles where there might leave some animals on the north or the south areas living, or more vegetation maybe for them to eat and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great hypothesis. I don't know again enough about it, and I haven't really thought of that before. But it'd be interesting to see if anybody's talked about that. There's a lot of geology papers, a lot of geologists that are interested in this topic, and they've written a lot of papers. They've hypothesized a lot of things. So it might be interesting to kind of look that up. But yeah, that's really interesting, but outside of my area of expertise.
There's a PhD in it for you, Kent.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Great question. There was somebody else started a question the same time Kent did. Was there another question there?
I had a question, and I'm not sure it's a very good question, but the general concept of punctuated evolution, I would gather that your general research and refinement of data and interpretation and so on, it would be in large part a critique of that idea. Is that accurate?
No.
Okay.
And that's a great question. And I love thinking about punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. And I think it's the kind of the debate you're getting at. So Darwin's often credited with the idea of gradualism, where you kind of slowly evolve in different ways. And it's kind of this gradual trek in kind of the tortoise instead of the hare. And then punctuated equilibrium is more of just burst in diversity and then slow down after that. I've actually done studies testing for bursts like that, and I see evidence for bursts like that, but I see them about 10 million years before the KPG boundary. So I hinted at that I cited that old paper of mine. Now I say old 2016 paper that argued that mammals were diversifying before the boundary. I'm working on a new project with a lot more data, and we're continuing to find evidence for that. And we're seeing that kind of punctuated equilibrium where you just see a burst, but the burst is occurring at a different time than the KPG boundary. It's not lining up with the KPG boundary. So I think there were those adaptive radiations, those bursts, those punctuated equilibrium. I'm kind of on that side. I think that Gould and Eldridge kind of stole that idea from G.G. Simpson. So if you're familiar with George Gaylord Simpson,
Oh, yeah.
a mammal paleontologist, he basically had the same idea. He called it quantum evolution instead of punctuated equilibrium, by this idea you have rapid evolution into adaptive zones or ecological niches. And I think Gould and Eldridge kind of ran with that idea a little bit. And Simpson's one of my heroes, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. As a little side note, I basically tested that idea with bats. So bats, we don't have a good fossil record of. So I just looked at used modern bats, and I worked with Charlene Santana, a researcher at University of Washington, and we did some kind of fancy phylogenetic analyses where we looked at how, like, kind of rates of when the bats, phylostomen bats specifically, a family that's very diverse, that includes like vampire bats and nectarivores and things. And we found strong evidence that they experience a burst in diversity really rapidly, like you would expect with punctuated equilibrium, or quantum evolution, like Simpson calls it. So I published a paper last year arguing kind of in favor of that idea. But I could definitely see how my talk today kind of seems to kind of contradict that a little bit. But I didn't get a chance to really talk about the evidence I have for a burst happening potentially before that KPG boundary.
Got another question here in the audience. All right, Deborah.
So if the mammals were designed before the meteor, any thoughts as
I'm sorry, you kind of cut out there. I didn't get
So the question is, with the diversity, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so with the diversity of the mammals before the meteor impact, Deborah's wondering if there's any speculation as to why they were diversifying ahead of time.
I hinted at
When
it.
there's so many dinosaurs.
Yeah, I hinted at it in my talk, but or very briefly mentioned it. The flowering plants were diversifying in the late Cretaceous, and flowering plants like they're called angiosperms, and they with them. So compared to ferns or conifers, pine trees, things like that, that are kind of slower growing, flowering plants basically, and those type of plants will kind of fight predators in a way, or fight herbivores in a way. It's not, it's not very appealing to go up to a pine tree and try to eat those leaves. But what flowering plants did is they adapted like a new method of fighting herbivory. They said, we're just going to out reproduce you. We're just going to make so many flowering plants, so many weeds, so many flowering plants, so many trees that you can eat as much of us as you want, but we're still just going to out reproduce you. And so suddenly basically the productivity in the environment in the last 10, 15, 20 million years before the KPG boundary went up rapidly, because you had these plants basically starting off as weeds, but grew and eventually evolved into trees and all kinds of diversity of flowering plants that we have today. They just took off, and they started to produce seeds that mammals would have been dispersing, and so there would have been a kind of coevolution between the evolution of fruits and seeds with the mammals. Again, mammals would have liked to probably live up in those, in a lot of those trees. There would have been a lot of food items, a lot of insects that would have been pollinating those flowers that mammals might have been eating. And so we, I myself, Greg Wilson, who I cited in my talk a few times, and others have hypothesized that it's really the flowering plants and their diversification and the insects that came with them, diversifying 10, 15, 20 million years before the KPG boundary, that really helped spur the mammals to diversify. And then I mentioned earlier, I think the knocking out the big herbivorous dinosaurs was maybe what opened up the kind of the niches for the big herbivorous mammals. But many of the other ecological niches were already starting to be filled, at least in my opinion. And it's something like those flowering plants makes more sense to me as potential cause for the diversification of mammals.
So one more thought that I had on that note, I've heard a lot of discussion about how volcanism had started to deplete dinosaurs prior to that. So is it possible that dinosaurs were affected by the volcanism when maybe the mammals were not so much? And so clearing some of the species of dinosaurs ahead of time may have also given opportunities for mammals to
Yeah.
diversify?
Yeah, there's an ongoing debate over that. Some are just some researchers, dinosaur researchers, Brusati is an example. Steve Brusati, famous one in over in Scotland. He argues dinosaurs are doing great and then got knocked out right at 66 million years ago. Other researchers have done fancy modeling work and analyses and said nope, dinosaurs were on the downhill before. So there's still debate there, but you look at something like sauropods, the long neck dinosaurs, very diverse in the Jurassic kind of globally, and then we're kind of getting phased out, I guess. And you know, there's some evidence that something like those long neck sauropods just weren't as adapted for like those angiosperms, those flowering plants, and might have been kind of on the way out because of that. Yeah, and then the volcanism issue ties into that, but the volcanism was still within if that mass extinction event was partially triggered by the volcanism. There's still debate on that as well. Like over in India, Himalayas area, basically where that would have been occurring, as like India is basically ramming into or start about to ram into Asia. That volcanism was, I think, really started about a million years before the KPG boundary. So it might have been like, it might have helped knock things out, but things like the downfall of the sauropods, those long neck dinosaurs, probably was, had occurred started tens of million years before that. So it's also kind of a time scale issue. If you're kind of zooming in on the boundary and different effects before and after and looking at a few million year time period, or zooming out, which is kind of more what I'm doing and looking at kind of big chunks of 5 or 10 million years at a time. So it's a really tricky question because you might get different answers depending on if somebody's looking broadly at dinosaurs or whether they're zooming in, close to that KPG boundary.
Brilliant. Thank you. I love it. All right. I'm done with my questions. Anybody else online? Anybody else has a final question for the doctor? All righty. Well, thank you so much. This was a fantastic presentation. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we really appreciate that. And I'm sure people will send some emails. I presume your publication is available somewhere out there to read.
Yeah. If you go to Google Scholar or google.scholar.com or whatever it is and look me up, I have, I'd say about 20 publications now, and a lot of those are fossil based. I cited a few of them today, but there are a lot more in there. So yeah, if you have any questions, thoughts, feel free to email me, and we'd love to make it up there in person sometime.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm 4 hours away, and right now packed in by 2 feet of snow. But
Yep. Well, probably August 2nd is our FossilFest here in Tualatin. And we have all sorts of displays and demonstrations, and we would love to have you down for that if you're not out there hunting dino and mammals.
Yeah, and one thing I'll mention too is I will be up in Portland at the end of March for anatomy conference. It's the American Association of Anatomy is having a big conference in Portland, and sometimes paleontologists like myself go to that. So if anybody's interested in that, you can find that online. I think it's called Anatomy Connected, and probably 1 or 2,000 people, I imagine, researchers go to that. But anybody's welcome. So
we'll look it up. We'll let everybody know. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. You're welcome to stick around and listen to our business meeting. It's going to be very quick, or you can take off for the night.
I will probably take off for the night, but again, I enjoyed it.
Don't blame you.
Yeah, thank you for the stimulating questions and conversation. So
yeah, thank you again. I'm going to stop the recording and have a great night.
Let's see.
Thank you very much.